For those of you who don't, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Keith Cook, and I'm the department head of biomedical engineering. Um, this is a new type of event that we're trying to have, and I really think for two purposes. One is really to reconnect with some of our alums who are out there working, and then secondly, to really try to put those alums in touch with our current students, to talk to them about really their work, their professional journey, and provide some guidance on getting a job at companies like Medtronic. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to the panelists for joining us. Thank you to all of our students for joining us here. So I want to just start tonight by having the panelists introduce themselves. So for each of the panelists, I can call on you one by one, I guess. Please introduce yourself with your name, your CMU degree or degrees. I think some of you have multiple, and what you do at Medtronic. So why don't we start with you, Gerald?
Thanks, Keith, and thanks for everybody for joining. So my name is Gerald Retman. I'm a distinguished engineer at Medtronic in our spinal business in Memphis, Tennessee. I graduated from CMU with a master's degree in biomedical engineering as well as a PhD in biomedical engineering.
All right, Carissa?
Hi, everyone. I'm Carissa Hernandez. I graduated from CMU with a dual degree, chemical engineering, biomedical engineering, back when you had to do the double major to get the BME. I'm currently a project manager in our new product development for mainly wound management, so sutures. I'm also in an interim core team leader role until they find a replacement for someone who a few weeks ago left. So it's kind of a great way for me to learn a role, figure out if I want to do it before I actually am ready to do it.
And Carissa, they still have to do the additional major. That's
Okay.
that's still going on. Alyssa?
Hello, my name is Alyssa. I am an R&D engineer level 2 at Medtronic, so still pretty fresh. I work in new product development in our structural heart business, and particularly on mitral valve replacement. And I did mechanical and biomedical engineering for my undergrad at CMU, and then stayed on for the 5th-year master's program in biomedical engineering.
Thanks, Alyssa. And Sabrina?
Hey everyone, I'm excited to be here. I'm Sabrina Liu. I graduated from CMU undergrad. I was material science with the additional major in BME, and I'm a technical sourcing program manager. So I support new product development within the coronary and renal denervation operating unit within the broader cardiovascular portfolio.
Thanks a lot. And I'm going to start the next questions, and really any of our panel members, feel free to jump in. You don't feel like you all have to answer, but I'd love to hear everyone's view on the next set of questions. So I'm going to ask a few more, and then at some point I'm going to reach out to everyone, all of the students, current CMU students, to add their questions. So I'll ask maybe 4 questions, and then I'll turn it over to all of you in the viewing audience to ask questions. So my next question is, how did your college education translate to industry?
I'll jump in on that one. I'd say it translated to certain parts of my roles in industry, and in certain areas it didn't. I was biomedical engineering major undergraduate at Mississippi State, and then for both of my graduate degrees at Carnegie Mellon, biomedical engineering. But my focus area was in material science and structural mechanics, and so my graduate theses were focused on material science, and spent time focusing on structural mechanics as my upper level electives in undergraduate. And I think when I first got my first job, it was more of a mechanical design role, a lot of CAD work, a lot of design work, interacting with surgeons to get feedback on those designs. And so that really required a lot more on-the-job training. I think a lot of my CAD work was probably freshman year of college. And so, definitely had to learn a lot more in that area on the job, as well as different software packages. But it kind of maybe 5, 6, 7 years in my career, our group started focusing a lot more on, structural integrity of cardiovascular stents, with a lot of work with fatigue testing and finite element modeling and fatigue lifetime predictions, material characterization. And so that's where the learnings that I had through school were really applicable. So I think it can be a mix of both. I think in my current role, it's been, a lot of work with mechanical design and software, which is also a lot more on-the-job training. But I think, elements of what you learn, throughout school definitely will pop up at different periods of time in your career, and particularly relative to the type of job that you have.
I'll echo that a little bit. I definitely do a lot of CAD work, but something that did surprise me is that a lot of times it's for testing fixtures, not the actual device. So maybe not quite as creative and fun as designing a whole device in CAD, but a lot of times just something that you're using in the lab. But it's still really interesting and good practice hands-on stuff. And then also one thing that we've been focusing a lot on in the last couple of years at Medtronic is a lot of predictive engineering and reliability models. So building things from a first principles point of view, which is you start out with a free body diagram, you're starting with the pretty basic formulas and stuff that we learned in school. And that was something that surprised me a lot, was how much I was actually using things like fluid mechanics and some of the stuff we learned in cardiovascular mechanics to actually try to predict at a basic level with lots of assumptions how our devices were going to behave, so that we had a little bit more gut check on our testing values in the lab. And I'd say those are the top two things that I really carried with me, aside from the things like the anatomical background from the BME classes and stuff like that.
I'll add on to that as well. So right now I work in sourcing supply management. I never imagined I end up in a sourcing supply management role. When I first started working at Medtronic, I started out as a product engineer, but eventually moved into this sort of role because it was a good mix of like the technical and the business acumen, which I was really interested in. But I would say overall, in addition to a lot of the technical skills, that Gerald and Alyssa mentioned was, of course, critical thinking, problem solving, working in teams, as well as time management and prioritization. I mean, those are skills that you'll carry forth with you throughout your whole career. And I also feel like the BME program at CMU gave me a really solid foundation into the world of both academia and industry. And so in college, I actually did a lot of like tissue engineering, biomaterials research. I actually volunteered in Dr. Cook's lab my freshman year for a little bit. And then later in college pivoted to more, want to go into industry. And I thought that was really great to kind of be able to explore both pathways and continue to discover, what eventually I want to go into. So.
I don't have a lot more to add to that. I think everybody gave some good examples, and similar to Sabrina, I didn't necessarily see myself being in a project management role when I left school. So the time management is a key thing, but it's also just using the skills, problem solving, that's, I think, basic to being an engineer, that you can leverage and you figure out what resources are available. You don't need to know everything. You learn on the job. But BME was especially helpful in understanding and working with other engineers, because now that I know for sure that you have the forced double major, but even their capstone project, you're working with a diverse group of engineers to figure out a problem. And that's real world. You're not working only with mechies or only with ECEs. And so that's a good skill set to have. And I think it's necessary no matter where you want to end up.
Thanks a lot. I especially appreciate the shout outs to cardiovascular mechanics and my lab. So thank you for that. So my next question is there anything that was unexpectedly useful for working at Medtronic? Something from your undergrad or your degrees at CMU?
I'll start with that. Yeah, I guess maybe just adding on to the previous question as well. I mean, our Medtronic's tagline is engineering the extraordinary, right? So they expect, even if you're not in a necessarily purely engineering role, to have an engineering mindset when it comes to solving problems, regardless of your background or your current role. So yeah, I think for me, having that technical background, especially when I went into sourcing, because I still need to be very close to kind of the technical aspects of the product, was really useful for me in making that transition.
Add on there, for me, I think it was probably, going through the process of graduate research, getting exposed to, having to, develop a thesis and think through, how to, do the research to try to answer the question, and, compile your data, summarize your results and present that information out. I think that was really helpful because some of the roles that I've been in, I've had to go through very similar work to, really do a lot of exploratory research, whether it's evaluating new technologies or, trying to answer some, pretty heavy technical questions on products. I think getting that exposure, was really helpful for certain aspects of my career.
One thing that I don't necessarily think was a surprise for me and a skill that I would need, but I guess CMU prepared me well, is early on in my career, I was a manufacturing engineer and we had to do a lot of engineering studies and DOEs, and being able to clearly document your plan and then the results. I think like that didn't seem like too big of a challenge for me, but I had peers that they just did not do that well. So I think through the coursework and other things, it's beneficial when you have those fundamentals.
I think one other thing that CMU does a really, really good job of that I didn't necessarily think much of during school was presentation skills. I think I had maybe 4 or 5 classes that taught the assertion evidence model, and I was like, okay, we get it. And then I got to industry and I realized how many, especially technical engineers, do not necessarily have those kinds of skills to be able to tell a story, summarize the information in a way that is actually understandable to people who didn't do it themselves. And so I would definitely not slack off and pay attention in those classes, because it really, really, really goes a long way. Because I don't think there's ever been a single day at work where I didn't have to explain to somebody else what I was doing or understand what somebody else was telling me they were doing.
Thanks a lot. So my next question goes to the the point where everyone is looking for a job. So when should students start to look for a job?
I'd say it's you want to start the process of thinking through what it is you want to do pretty early. I think, internships, co-ops are critically important. They really get you that exposure to what these jobs, could be, things that you may not like, and you won't know that until you get into it. But then they also help with, having, demonstration that you've, had some level of industry experience before you apply for the job. But I think, maybe even in that junior year, really starting to think through kind of what type of jobs you might want to do, what are things that interest you the most, and really start that networking process. Trying to connect with people who are working in industry, doing informational interviews to try to make those network connections, to try to better understand, the companies that are out there, the technologies behind the products. And, a lot of times it really is the technology behind the product that really describes, what is the skill set that's needed for the role. And so if you, look across different companies, look across different products, really try to understand what's the base technology behind the product, so that you can kind of understand what are the skill sets that the hiring managers are going to be looking for when they're looking for engineers in those roles. And then I think relative to actually applying for the job, usually in that 2 to 3 month range before you get ready to graduate, I think that's probably a good time frame to start applying. Most jobs and the hiring process usually takes a few months to get all of the candidates reviewed and selected and do the on-site interviews. And usually, companies are going to want people to start pretty soon after they accept an offer. So you don't want to start too early where you wouldn't be able to start the job if you get an offer. So I'd say that 2 to 3 month time window before you graduate is a good time to actually start applying.
Also, I'm sure a lot of you are younger undergrads as well. The internship applications are usually open maybe starting August or September and only go through November. So it's a pretty short window, but we do a lot of intern to full-time conversions. I was one myself. And if you do that, you'll usually get the full-time offer at the very end of your internship. So you can have your full-time job secured, your whole school year, which is really nice. So if you're interested in internships and stuff like that as well, definitely early fall is when we do most of our intern hiring.
Can I just ask a follow-up about that, Alyssa? So
Yeah.
where would they learn about those internships?
Probably just on the jobs website. It's jobs.medtronic.com.
Okay.
They'll list those internships sometime late summer, I think.
Yeah, I think to Alyssa's point, that's really important to recognize if you're looking for a internship in the summer of the next year, the postings and applications for those jobs, they get posted in kind of late summer, early fall of the prior year. So like for 2025 or summer 2025, the application process would start around August to September of 2024.
Any other thoughts, or did we cover that one pretty well? Okay. So my last question before I turn it over to the audience is, what recommendations do you have for students preparing a resume or interviewing?
Yeah, so Gerald mentioned this one, but networking is super, 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 super important. Like even like informational interviews, just, reaching out to people, just asking more about their day to day, and that will help narrow down to what type of role you're looking for as well. And also you could ask them, in your day to day, what are you looking for in your coworkers? What is important? It's a really valuable way, even if you're not necessarily interested in that particular company, but maybe you're interested in that role, or maybe that company doesn't have any openings. It's still really important to just make those connections. And something that, I learned pretty recently, I've been at Medtronic now for almost 6 years, but if you guys have ever heard of the PI theory of success, it stands for performance, image, exposure. And performance is only 10%, image is 30%, and exposure is 60%. And I would say that's been my experience so far at Medtronic. I mean, the roles and the career progression that I've had is through, my network, through learning about opportunities within that network, and then people vouching for me to reach for those opportunities. So definitely recommend you doing that, starting to expand your network. And then just, taking advantage of the resume writing workshops, making sure you're getting help with those resumes and having people look over them. And interview practice as well, I would say. But yeah, networking is super important.
I agree with that. And I think with the resume and the interviews themselves, trying to think of things in what at least Medtronic uses called the STAR method. So situation or task, action, and results. So really think about the impact you made on different projects. Don't just list like the project itself, but think about, okay, you did this project and what was that outcome? Or at least when you're answering those questions in the interview, what was the result? What could have been done differently or things like that. Think of it kind of like the storyline that Alyssa mentioned for presentations, because that will help drive the point versus just like, oh yeah, I have some experience doing this. Like be confident and try to prep in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that Carissa highlighted. The behavioral interview questions are pretty typical. And so always have a few examples that you can pull from, so that when you get asked that question about, tell me about a time when this happened, or tell me about a time when you encountered, some type of conflict or something like that. You've got a couple of project examples or things that have happened that you can essentially pull from to go through that STAR interview response approach. Other couple other things I would highlight is, your resume, make sure you know your resume forwards and backwards. Always be able to explain everything on your resume. I think that's, one of the things that can maybe throw you off a little bit if, you get asked a question about something on your resume and you aren't able to explain it very well. The other thing is, I'd say is make sure you, in the interview process, kind of do your homework about the company up front. It's always good to have questions that you ask back to the interviewer. And so, make sure that you've, done a little bit of research about the group, the products, and have some questions that you could ask back to the interviewer at the end of the process. And that'll show that you really have been, looking into this job and you have a pretty good interest in trying to land this role. One other thing I always tell people too is be enthusiastic. I think that's, you start thinking about, when you get to the point of the interview, you're down to you and a couple of other candidates. So you're really close to getting the job. And some things become, very small nuanced elements that can separate you from the other person. And sometimes it's just enthusiasm. Sometimes you can have somebody who's very skilled, have a really good resume, but sometimes they can come into the interview and appear that, they're kind of indifferent about whether or not they get the job. Versus you can have another candidate that may not have the exact same skill sets, but their enthusiasm for the role it really shines through the interview. And sometimes those candidates bubble to the top. So just have that enthusiasm about the interview process, and then also, try to make sure you do a follow-up thank you. It's going back to the ideal of things that can help separate you from the other candidates. And I think, when you follow up with the interviewers to let them know that you thank them for their interview, maybe mention some specific things about the interview that you guys discussed, I think that can help you stand out.
Yeah, and even though it's a really big company, and I know you're applying to tons of jobs, looking at the job description and finding ways to highlight skills that actually match that description on your resume or during your interview can be really, really helpful. And definitely echo what Gerald said about the enthusiasm for Medtronic specifically. I was recruiting at the SWE conference in the fall, and one of the first questions that we used to try to pick out people that we thought were really good potential candidates is, what do you know about Medtronic and what brings you to Medtronic compared to all the different other medical device companies. So people are big on that, if you know the mission statement, if you know what the company stands for, because it's really a big part of who we are, and we want new hires to reflect that.
That's some great advice. Thank you. I am now going to open it up to questions from the attendees. Hopefully everyone feels brave in kicking off these questions. Is there anyone with questions? And if you want to put them into the chat as well, I can read them off. No one feels like being brave. I have more questions if not, but I really do want to get to your questions. Okay, so I've got one question here. Can you share any memorable or significant moments from your career that have had a long-lasting impact on you?
I could share one. I think with when I worked in our structural heart business for our transcatheter heart valve program, I had the opportunity to work on a product called the Melody transcatheter heart valve. And, this is a device that's used to treat, essentially kids who have congenital heart disease. and particularly the pulmonary artery and the outflow tract of the RV. These kids have had to undergo multiple surgeries to repair that. And so this device was particularly intended to try to mitigate those surgeries and really prevent the need for the kids to have to go back through multiple surgeries, because you could go in and place the valve into an existing conduit with a cardiovascular stent. And so essentially the valve is attached to the inner diameter of that stent. And you know, it was a very challenging product. Was the first transcatheter device approved in the U.S. market by the FDA. And there was a lot of technical challenge with the loading conditions on that device. And so being involved in kind of that early stage work on transcatheter heart valve technology and the product that directly impacted the lives of kids was really rewarding.
Yeah, similar to Gerald, I work on the renal denervation, well, the next generation RF generator, but the current generator iteration and the entire system just got FDA approval this past November. And that was a huge milestone because Medtronic acquired the technology, you know, over a decade ago, and it had been a really long road to get there. But renal denervation is a treatment for hypertension or high blood pressure. Which affects, you know, so many people around the world. So just having that milestone and, you know, just putting all of the work into perspective and the really tangible impact that you can have was really cool. So yeah, similar to response to Gerald, but yeah, the patient impact part of it was really awesome.
Yeah, and I just echo that for you, Sabrina. That was a huge accomplishment for the group, though.
It was a long road, but we got there eventually. So
both of these obviously are really highlighting the impact our products can have. And one thing that I think I've really enjoyed about Medtronic, because when I started, I was at Covidien, which was acquired back in 2015. But every year we have a holiday program where we highlight some patient stories. And it's one of those, like, if you can't make it the day of, it kind of sucks because it would be great to do it, but like you have to go back and hear the stories about different patients. And even this year, one of my coworkers was sharing a story about his daughter, who she was 6 days old, had to have surgery. But it just, like, it hits home because sometimes they are employees who are here sharing their story about a loved one or themselves and the product that's used. So I just think we are very mission driven, as Alyssa said, and that's one of the reasons why I have stayed at Medtronic as long as I have.
We have another question in the chat. So one of the attendees said that they're curious about your application process that ultimately helped you all land jobs at Medtronic. So how much did you network to get the job, and does sending applications make as much of an impact as networking? I sort of the relative worth of those two things. And then there's one more question after that. I'll let you answer that first.
So for me, it wasn't necessarily my network within CMU, but I had received my first internship through, like, a family friend who got my resume on the pile, and then obviously had to interview and whatnot. But then my full-time role came out of that internship. So unlike Alyssa, I didn't have that offer at the end of that summer. Fortunately, there was a little bit of a reduction in staff during that last summer I was there. But my hiring manager had reached out later and was like, hey, there are job openings, apply if you're interested. So having worked with her in the past kind of opened that door back again.
yeah, in terms of how I started at Medtronic, so I actually knew someone from my graduating class at CMU that worked in the group that I started in at Medtronic. And actually, the hiring manager, I did an informational interview with her, a few months before a role was even open. But again, kind of similarly, I was just wanting to find out more about the company and that particular site and the products that they made. And then once a role did become available, they actually reached back out to me, and I went through the whole process. So for me, it was actually um, my network. But that position was a contractor position, so it wasn't a theoretically full-time like salaried position, but then eventually I was converted to full-time with another group after that. But yeah, for me it was the networking.
Yeah, my process was more similar to what Alyssa mentioned earlier, was getting an internship with Medtronic while I was working on my master's degree, and then getting a full-time offer at the end of that internship. But I think, just kind of listening to both, Carissa and Sabrina and Melissa's comment earlier, I think it really highlights the importance of networking and internships in terms of getting that foot in the door when you're looking for a job.
I also got my first internship through the career fair at SWE conference when I was an undergrad. So anytime that you can get any kind of FaceTime with actual recruiters, whether it be through a conference or even something like this where you are reaching out to alumni, can be really helpful. We also have a referral program, so knowing people who work there, or like Sabrina said, informational interviews, that is always helpful as well.
Do you all have some sense of which conferences Medtronic actively recruits at? I mean, I think Alyssa, you've mentioned SWE. I'm sure there are some other ones, maybe NESB, but can you recommend some if people are trying to get FaceTime?
The primary ones are SWE, NESB, SPACE, and SHIP. And I think that Medtronic is kind of switching around. They don't have target schools anymore like they used to, which is great because CMU wasn't a target school. But I think that there's an intern ambassador program now. So I think that in general, they're trying to have people reach out to their alumni schools a lot more, which is really cool. But it's primarily the diversity conferences.
Thank you. There's a second part of that question. How did you ensure that you matched all of your skills to the given job description? Given that people's degrees in BME covers so many different areas.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, always suggest that people tailor their resume to the job description. So, and in current day, there are a lot of online resources that can help you do that. I'm aware of one where you can match your resume to a job description, and it'll help you, figure out how well does it match. So it's really that ideal of not having a single resume that you just kind of apply across, all jobs you apply for. Because one of the important things is to think through is one of the first, screens that happens when they're looking for candidates is that these resumes will go through, some type of filtering system that, is going to be looking for good matches between your skill sets and the job description or the job role. And then even once you get past that filter, you're going to have the HR person or the hiring manager is going to be looking through those filtered resumes and trying to see which ones appear to be a good match. And so I think it's not to falsely represent yourself on the resume. You want to make sure that what skills you call out are appropriate and true. But particularly make sure that the resume is just structured so that if you see certain things that they're looking for in the job description, you highlight things that you've done in your past or through your schoolwork that match to that job description.
We have a question specifically for Carissa. The question is, what does a day of PMP at Medtronic look like? what are the skill sets required for a project manager?
All right, thanks. I was just about to let you all know too, and unfortunately I have a prior engagement, but I can answer this question before I have to hop off. And also let you know that I'm on LinkedIn if people want to reach out. But having my PMP is kind of similar to like other degree or certification. It kind of helps ensure you aren't missing some of those boxes if that's the path you want to take. For me, a lot of it is getting teams together and getting them to that end goal. So using the project management fundamentals of like stakeholder analysis, Gantt and scheduling, influence is in my role. I don't have anybody that directly reports to me, but I have to influence cross-functional individuals to kind of make decisions and keep projects moving. I think other skills like budget, that's a part of, depending on the role that you're in, you may own the capital. So like that's kind of the equipment, facilities work, as well as the expense. So other cost as well as the resources, and understanding how that all fits together and keeping the project on track. And then getting a decent understanding of the business, which I don't think I had before I took on the role, but it's something I've learned in the role. So depending on what sort of project or managing position you're in, being able to communicate how that impacts the business and why that project is important, or why you need additional resources, whether that's individuals or spending to get something done, is key. So communication. And thanks, everyone.
Thanks for attending. We appreciate it. All right, so let's see. Don't think we have any more in the chat. Any questions from attendees? While you're all thinking, I'll ask one. Do all of you enjoy about your jobs?
I'll jump in there. I think you know, I think at the heart of engineering is problem solving. So I think that's what I really enjoyed about my job. In the various roles I've had at Medtronic, I think there are an you know inability to count the number of technical challenges that exist in the medical space. I think medical technology tends to trail technology in a lot of other industries. And it's just when you start thinking about the risk of these products to patients and the importance of ensuring safety, it really says that, when we look to implement new technology, we have to do it cautiously. And we have to be very diligent about, how we approach it. And so I think for me, it's really that ability to be able to really jump in on these efforts, whether it's designing something like a new device and kind of working through all of the different challenges that device will go through in terms of its usability and things that could go wrong in the procedure, and how do we make the design robust against those different possibilities, or if it's where something has gone wrong and we're trying to problem solve and troubleshoot and figure out what we need to do to try to fix or address that. Those types of challenges is what really gets me up in the morning, and it really challenges me to try to do my best every day.
I think going back to the patient impact that we talked about earlier as well, it's really interesting to do technical problems, but there comes a point when it's frustrating, or you have a hard day, or you're just stuck on a problem. But it is really easy to remind yourself why you're doing it and why it's important. And I feel like that makes it a little easier on the hard days, that I don't feel like some of my other friends who are at just other engineering companies that are not so patient centric may feel. So I really enjoy that. And also, I think that not only do I remind myself about that, but everybody who works around me, it feels that way too. So there's always kind of this common ground between people that you're all working towards the same, goal, which is to help the patient, which I think is just a good way to pull your head out of the weeds a little bit.
Yeah, just to add to Alyssa and Gerald. So yeah, I think what I enjoy is just the continuous learning aspect of my job and how that is very encouraged at Medtronic as well. So I work in sourcing, which means like I'm accountable for sourcing strategies, supplier relationship management, supplier selection, component development, supplier risk mitigation, all of that. And so I work with a lot, not just Medtronic, but I work with our suppliers. We work with a contract manufacturer who manufactures our product. So it's relationship building there. I interface with all of the different functions, not just sourcing and operations, but supplier quality, research and development, even like regulatory, the core team leadership. I'm kind of plugged into all these different networks. And so learning about how everything kind of fits together, how to balance internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, and just learning more about how everything fits together. I think that's something that's been very interesting to me, and getting to do things like negotiate contracts with suppliers and learn about yeah, it's just learning, things that that I never knew before. So I think that, and yeah, I think also something else I really enjoy about the company is that they're very, overall Medtronic is really supportive of your career development, like whether that's on the technical track, whether that's on the program management track, like myself, or whether that's, on the people management track. So for example, I got my second master's in IO psychology, which is like psychology of the workplace, and my management was super supportive of it. Medtronic partially funded it, and I just just completed like the Women in Operations Leadership Development Program, which was, a sponsored program where we got access to senior leaders, and we had a capstone project and all of that. And so, those other extra activities for your career and professional development have been really enriching, and Medtronic is really supportive of that as well. So that's something else I really enjoy about the company.
Thanks. We have a couple more questions from the chat. Are there any other electives that you recommend taking at CMU? Any other electives that you think benefited you the most in your careers, either professionally or personally?
Well, I mentioned earlier cardiovascular mechanics. That was especially helpful because I work in the cardiovascular space now. So that was probably the one that was most directly impactful to my day-to-day. But also rehabilitation engineering was really great because I think it talks a lot about user needs and human factors, which is something that I think we could all do a better job at remembering in our day-to-day. And it's something that's really important when a lot of our devices, the primary user is the doctor. And so it's helping the patient, but you're really talking with doctors. And so that was a really good one to go through some human factors exercises. And then also medical devices, it's a little bit more broad, but you talk a lot about some recalls, and you do case studies and learn a little bit about more the FDA process, which is also really helpful just for general context when you're on a product development team. You kind of know the phases of the design cycle and what is necessary to, what is a 510K, what's the PMA approval, stuff like that. And but I think those are probably my top three for general device knowledge.
I'll just add the, kind of to Alyssa's point, any elective that, kind of strengthens your competency in an area that you have interest in can be really useful. Like she mentioned, the cardiovascular mechanics, being in the structural heart group and working with, prosthetic heart valves, that core technology really requires, that type of, background and knowledge and skill set. And so having a course like that can be really helpful. So I think if you think through kind of, what type of area you want to work in, what are the types of products or therapies that you would be developing or supporting. Try to see if you can find, courses that are going to strengthen your skill sets in that and kind of grow your competency in that area. The only other thing I would mention is, statistics. If you can do anything that improves on your statistics capabilities, statistics is extremely important, in pretty much any role in engineering. So I would recommend that.
I'll say one more thing also. I generally found that the master's level BME classes were the most helpful for industry because they all have some kind of project or literature review or bigger presentation style assignment, which is just generally very helpful. And you don't have to necessarily be a master's student to take those classes as your electives, right? So if you want to push yourself a little bit on that, I think that those were probably the most helpful.
Yeah, that's right. You don't have to be a master's student. You could be a, an upper level undergrad. Sabrina, any thoughts? I don't mean to put you on the spot,
Oh
but
no.
any,
No, I think Alyssa and Gerald covered it really, really well. Um, I would also say, so I don't know why I did, but I'm glad I did. I took a marketing class. It was like the first, it's like the only business class I ever took at CMU. But honestly, when it came to presentation skills and like visually how to organize a presentation, I mean, I got ripped apart in that class, but it was good because it really set me up well. And so, yeah, so, I would encourage people to do that as well, just do something completely different, even if it's something that maybe you might have a small interest in, or something to kind of bolster those skill sets as well, in addition to some of the technical skill sets that were mentioned.
just as a sidebar comment, I think it's sometimes unexpected what you get out of certain classes.
Yeah.
Like you get something out of it you don't expect when you go into it. I took a class on, I think it was something along, it was a sociology class involved with like human geography and movement and things like that. And that was the first time I was ever introduced to multivariate statistics. The statistics that they were using in that class were way beyond what we were doing in engineering. Um, and I think philosophically I carried that around with me, if not like technically.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see, next question. Next question is really a networking question, and that's, can people here today reach out to you for guidance about different roles than what you are doing at Medtronic? Can they pick your brain about sort of how they might enter into Medtronic in different areas?
Yeah, sure. Again, I
Yeah.
think I'm on LinkedIn. I'm sure others are on LinkedIn too. And I think if you have a question, I always am happy to chat with students, and help you build that network.
Yeah, me too. I'm on LinkedIn, and if I can't answer your specific questions about the role, hopefully I know someone who will be able to, that would be willing to as well.
Same.
All right, let's see, more questions. Maybe I'll throw one out here just to give people a chance to think a little bit. Um, if you had to do it all over again, what would you do differently? And that could be education, career.
Yeah, I think for me, it would probably be to get a little bit more hands-on experience with machining and mechanical design. I think, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of my educational focus was in material science and structural mechanics. And I think it's probably one thing that I think there still is somewhat of a little bit of a disconnect between academia and industry, is that I think sometimes academia is a heavily theoretical and maybe not as applied. And when you get to industry, you see a lot of application of engineering. And I think, in my first role was a mechanical design role. I think I could have benefited from maybe getting some exposure to working in the machine shop back at my undergrad at Mississippi State, as well as any kind of exposure at Carnegie Mellon, just to get more familiar with the equipment, more familiar with how things are made and produced, because that was a big component of that project, is really understanding manufacturing processes and what are some of the various different ways that you can make products and components.
Yeah, agreed. If I knew that I wanted to go into the med device industry earlier on in my college career, I probably would have switched my major to mechanical engineering instead of material science. But I will say we were doing component selection for the enclosure of the device that I work on, and we were debating between aluminum and steel alloys, and I was like, oh yeah, I can add a little bit of something to this. But no, I think that, yeah, if you are interested in more of that like mechanical design aspect of it, then that's probably what I would have done differently, as well as have more earlier on, more exposure to industry leaders and experience in industry as well.
We now have a medical device concentration within BME. I don't think that existed when any of you were here, but you can do that now. So we
That's
see
awesome.
our MECI BMEs split between that and the biomechanics focus these days. And I don't know how it was when you were here, but really I do think that the maker space has really improved our ability to teach those same skills that you were talking about, Gerald. It's just made it, and I think as faculty, we really appreciate this, where before, if we wanted our students to pick up those skills, it was very challenging or relatively challenging. And now we just say, go to Makerspace, go take a class, come back when you know how to do this.
Yeah, I've seen it on a couple of recent visits to the campus. Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
All right. Any more questions from our audience? I think that if there are no more questions from the audience, then I'll just thank our speakers. Anyone else with questions? All right, then thank you very much to the panelists. I really do appreciate you spending time with us. Hopefully we'll see you soon, either at a conference or at Carnival. Please come back and say hello. And thank you to everyone who came tonight. I really think this was a success, that we had this many people present.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Keith.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.